So, good morning everyone. It's time to continue our study on Revelation chapter 9. This is study number 11 in the Revelation series. And this is an interesting chapter. There's two time prophecies coming up. We began on them last week, but we never completed them. So, before we begin further, I'd like to read a passage from the book Desire of Ages by Ellen White. And this helps to define the understanding that we want to get from these studies and see that the kingdoms of the world and even religious kingdoms that are built on force and on wrong concepts about God and His character, and nations that are built on wrong concepts about God and His character, will all fall. They'll rise and then they'll fall again. Jesus is building an eternal kingdom. He said, "My kingdom is not of this world." And when he said that, he taught a great truth. And when he was alive on the earth, he was demonstrating what that kingdom was like. So Jesus loved the Romans, he loved the Pharisees, he loved the Sadducees, he loved the Herodians, he loved the Jewish zealots, he loved the Jewish people, he loved the people everywhere. But sometimes he had to warn them that their course of action was heading for destruction. And I think we can say the same today as we study the book of Revelation. We can see that those who have ruled, those who have arisen by force and deceiving people, often unintentionally perhaps, but deceiving people as to what God is like, leading them away from the real truth, that they are going to fall at some stage. But Christ is building a kingdom which is solid and will last forever. So when we study the book of Revelation 9, we should see that this is a principle which we should always have in our minds, to look at the revolutionary teaching of Jesus Christ at the time he was actually here on this earth. And before Jesus, the great prophet was Moses and Elijah. Moses didn't fully understand that God's kingdom was based solely on love, the principle of love. But Jesus, when he came, he taught that principle. And this was recognized by people in other religions too. Gandhi, for instance, said at one time that he likes the Christian Jesus, but he doesn't like the Christian nations and the way they operated. So the fundamentals of Christ's teaching people find attractive, and when religion is forced upon people, or not to have religion is forced upon people, as in communism, atheism, then these are showing that freedom is taken away from the people and put in the hands of governments or religions. And the worst situation for people is when governments and religions get together and persecute the rest. And Jesus warned against this on many occasions. So I'd like to read from the book Desire of Ages, just a short paragraph here. And here we have this thought coming out. God could have destroyed Satan and his sympathizers as easily as one can cast a pebble to the earth, but he did not do this. Rebellion was not to be overcome by force. Compelling power is found only under Satan's government. So compelling power is found only under Satan's government. So therefore, God's government doesn't have compelling power. If we don't do what God wants us to do, he leaves us to that choice. And that choice does have outworkings, and we have to reap those outworkings if we disconnect ourselves fully from God. So it goes on to say, the Lord's principles are not of this order. His authority rests upon goodness, mercy, and love. And the presentation of these principles is the means to be used. God's government is moral, and truth and love are to be the prevailing power. And they will be. So we can divide the whole world into two camps, those who operate by truth and love, and those who operate by force and deception. And God will find most of us somewhere in the middle of that. But we will be tending by our lives, throughout our lives, either towards truth and love or towards force and deception. So we will be judged by which way we are operating towards. And right at the end of time, there will be a group of people who will operate only under truth and love. So that quote is from Desire of Ages, page 759, and it's by Ellen White. It's a very good quote. She was a great Christian writer. So now we want to go to verse 9 of Revelation. And as I said earlier, there's two prophecies here we're going to look at. And we don't specifically get a starting date for these prophecies, except it's in Revelation chapter 9, verse 11. So Revelation chapter 9, verse 11 is the key to understanding these prophecies, because it gives us a starting date. And really, if you didn't listen to last week's study, you should really listen to that first, because otherwise you might get lost if you're not familiar with this chapter. So let's read what it says in verse 11. And they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue has his name Apollyon. So what do these words Abaddon and Apollyon mean? They mean destroyer. Means destroyer. And in the context of this prophecy, certainly this king that was over them, or kingdom. A king often stands for a kingdom in Bible prophecy. A lot of Bible prophecy is symbolic, or we start with a geographical place or a real person, and then God moves us on to understand some symbolism that explains everything further on as we go deeper and deeper into the books of Daniel and Revelation. So one example of that would be that there was Israel, the person. There was a man called Israel in the Old Testament, and from that we get the name Israel, the nation. But then we get spiritual Israel, which is one step further, which can be somebody from any nation who follows the light of God. So we go from something real to something more and more symbolic as we understand it. And so in this case, a king equals a kingdom. So the prophecy is, firstly, we have 150 years. As we talked about last week, mentions 150 days twice in this chapter, that the power would hurt. First word that's used is torment. The other word is hurt. For 150 days, which means 150 years. So we need to know when that time period began. And it's from when they had a king over them. And who was that king? It was Othman, the first king of the Saracens. We can say Turks. Was where the central part of his empire lay. And when did he first make his incursion into the Roman Empire and torment and hurt that empire? 1/3 of it. 1/3 of the Roman Empire, the Greek portion. Of it, he attacked. It was when he attacked Nicomedia, which was a part of the Greek portion of the empire. The Roman Empire was divided into 3 parts at the death of Constantine, who was way back in time, back in the 300s. But this Greek portion was based around Constantinople, which became later known as Istanbul. That was the centre of the Greek portion of the empire. And this first attack, according to Gibbon and according to other historians, Edward Gibbon was the writer of the decline and the fall of the Roman Empire. And he puts the date at the 27th of July, 1299. 1299. Okay, let's go back to verse 10. And they had tails like unto scorpions, and there were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men 5 months. So that's what it says there. 5 months is a prophetic time. 5 times 30 days to a month equals 150 years. Then we go to verse 12. One woe is past, and behold, there come two woes more hereafter. So here we are in the fifth trumpet, and that was the attacks of the Saracens, who were initially began under Muhammad and then under Abu Bakr. This is the fifth trumpet, and then we come to the sixth trumpet. And both these trumpets are angel trumpets, woe trumpets, sorry. They're both angels too, but they're both woes. And the reason is that the extent of the trouble was greater than the earlier troubles of the first four. And the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the sixth angel which had the trumpet, Loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. And the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year, for to slay the third part of men. So here earlier it's talking about 150 years or 5 months to torment or hurt the Greek portion of the Roman Empire. But here we have another time prophecy, and let's look at that. That is a year, which is 360 days in Bible prophecy. And the reason that it's different in Bible prophecy to today is probably the changes that took place at the time of the flood. When the sun was darkened, it apparently changed the length of the days. But certainly in Bible prophecy, 360 days is what a year is, whenever you look at Bible prophecy. So we have a day plus plus 30 days, a month. So we have a year plus 30 days equals a month, plus, let's read it again, a day, and then an hour. So we have 391 days or years plus 1 hour. 1 hour is 1/24. An hour, 1 hour is 1/24 of a year. So if you go 24s into 360, you come up with 15, plus 15 days. So this is quite precise, isn't it? And we're going to look at this in more detail. So let's now see that I need some room on the board here. Everyone's got that so far. And we want to see that this was perfectly fulfilled. This time prophecy was perfectly fulfilled. As we go through it, we need this date here, the 27th of July. Yes, so the loosing of these 4 angels made it possible for the Saracens to invade the Greek Empire. And the loosening of those angels, it was necessary for this to happen, because the angels holding back the winds of strife. Today in Revelation 7 we looked at it, that the angels today are holding back these winds of strife. So on the 27th of July 1299, the king of the Saracens, Othman, invaded Nicomedia, as we had on the board. I'll just rearrange the board a bit here. So the Turks invaded the Greek Empire on that date. That's a very, very specific date. And the Bible says that for 150 years they would torment and hurt that empire. But they couldn't take Constantinople itself, and that's where the emperor was. So they couldn't conquer it fully. They could only hurt and torment as a scorpion stings. So if you've been somewhere where there's scorpions, as I have in India, and one night I was called upon to sleep on the top of a house on a roof. And when was actually me, I think, was the only one up there, when they said you'll have to watch out for scorpions. And when I was up there, it wasn't long before I saw some. It was dark. We arrived late at night, it was dark, and there was scorpions there. And so I had to move from that spot to another part of the house on the floor. So the danger of a scorpion biting you is probably not death-threatening normally. It can be in some parts of the world. But in India, it's a very painful sting in that part of India, in Tamil Nadu. So I was very aware of that. And so a scorpion torments, but it doesn't normally kill. And this is what the picture is. The scorpions coming out of the desert, this waste place, and attacking the Roman Empire even more. They'd been attacking it since the year 628, I think it was. And now we're up to 1299. So for well over 600 years, almost 700 years, they'd been attacking the Roman Empire. And now, on this specific date, they had a king over them for the first time. Before then, it was basically tribes gathered together, but now the whole empire had been brought together by having a king. So this leads us, with the 150 years, this leads us to 1449. And at that time, the emperor of the Greek Empire, John Paleologos, or however you exactly pronounce it, Logos, he died around 1448. And his brother, he had no children, he had no male son, I should say. His brother wanted to be the new emperor. So the brother sent his ambassadors to the Sultan to ask his permission to be inaugurated or crowned as the next emperor of the Romans, of the Greek part of the empire. And so he was so scared to go against the Sultan, because the Sultan had so much power, that he had to ask permission first. Now, from the Sultan's point of view, they couldn't get into Constantinople up to that point of time. For all those years since the 300s, the city of Constantinople had been attacked by all sorts of people. I've got a list here of the people who had attacked Constantinople for 1100 years. They had been attacking it, and some of the people who had attacked Constantinople are these people: the Goths, the Huns, the Avars, the Persians, the Bulgarians, the Saracens, the Russians, the Ottoman Turks had all had a go at Constantinople. But the walls were built so strong and so high and solid that they couldn't get in through the walls. And that was the situation. But the new Greek emperor therefore asked permission of the Sultan. He knew that the Sultan could try and get in again, and that this time he might be successful, because it was a time when they were making bigger guns, and gunpowder was becoming far more in use at that time, and among the Saracens too. And cannon was becoming much more in use. So the new emperor asked permission of the Sultan to be, whether he could be the emperor or not. And the Sultan blessed him and said, okay. But that Sultan died soon after. And then a new Sultan, who was Muhammad, number 2, came into power around 1451. And the new Sultan, he wanted to get inside Constantinople. He wanted to conquer it. So in the event which took place in 1449 was that the new emperor to be crowned asked permission and got it, and was crowned with the old Sultan's approval, the one who was living at his time. He got it with his approval. Therefore he was saying, we put our lives in your hands. We can't do anything unless you approve. But that Sultan couldn't get into Constantinople up to that point of time. For 1100 years they'd been trying to get in. All these different people had been trying to get in and couldn't get in. So this new Sultan, who came to power around 1451, he had some contacts, and one of his contacts was a man who made big cannon, and he got this man to come over to his side, and he asked the man, can you build a cannon which will knock down the walls of Constantinople? And the man said that he would certainly try. So they made these enormous cannons. And we'll take up the Bible story again here. And they began the siege of Constantinople in 1453. That's when it began, and in a few months they took the city. So the 4 angels were loosed for an hour and a day and a month and a year. We're reading in verse 15 of chapter 9. For to slay the third part of men. So this time, before it was to hurt, to torment, there was some hope back then, some sort of hope, but now it was to slay, which was worse. Now we'll come to why it got worse as we go on, as we come to the last verses, but it got worse. So the number of the army which Mohammed had was considerable. And here it says, and the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000, and I heard the number of them. Now, the number is, it says, I heard the number of them. It's not clear what that number could be, because 200,000 would be 2 million, and that seems like, or is it 200 million? That seems like too much. But anyway, it was a big army, and the people who have recounted that army, one of them was Edward Gibbon. He's talked about from his research how big that army was, is that it stretched 600 miles. They invaded all through the Greek Empire and especially around Constantinople. And then they set up 14 of these big guns, big cannons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All around the city, and they were firing at the walls constantly. And eventually they started battering down the walls. And this is important to understand as we read on further in this account of it that John has given. And thus I saw the horses in the vision. Now it's a great truth that the Arabs used horses in their attacks, and John saw them not only around the walls, but he saw them invading the territory on their horses. And them that sat on them, having breastplates of fire and of jacinths and of brimstone, jacinth, or hyacinth. So the breastplates of fire, the Saracens wore a red, a blue and a yellow dress often. This was quite common for them to use those colours. And the fire represents the red, jacinth or hyacinth represents blue, and brimstone represents yellow in the symbolism. And the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions. Now don't forget that John was from a different time zone, and he was looking into the future from the distance. And so the horses featured in the way he looked at this scene as it was unfolding. So the horses were as the heads of lions, and out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone. So as the riders of the horses came across and attacked various places, they would fire their muskets, which had come into play at that time, from the horses, and it would look like it was coming out of the horse's mouth, because as they were riding along, they would ride along like this, and they could fire. And you imagine seeing the horses with this fire coming out of them. That's what it looked like to the prophet as he looked upon it. Also cannon. The cannon which they were using against the walls was making it look like there was fire coming out from around the city. Fire coming out of the cannon, and it seemed like it was coming from the out of the mouths of some beast to John in the vision. So we go now to verse 18. By these three, that is fire and smoke and brimstone, by these three was the third part of men killed, by the fire and by the smoke and by the brimstone which issued out of their mouths. So from the cannon issued fire, smoke and brimstone. Out of the muskets issued fire, smoke and brimstone. Now this was a changer, because Constantinople, as we've already said, I'll just put Constan, had never been captured. For 1100 years they had been trying, different ones had tried to capture that city. Nobody had been able to get in. But here, Constantinople in 1453 was taken by the Saracens, and it became Istanbul. And the Saracens made it their capital. So this is where it says to slay, because the emperor, the new emperor who had just been crowned, was killed, and many others, of course, when they entered into the city. It's a pretty sad story for those who were in Constantinople. So now we want to see the rest of this prophecy. So that takes us to 1449, when the emperor of the Greek Empire died, and the new emperor to be crowned asked permission of the Sultan to reign. So if we add to 1447, going to the 27th of July, as exactly 150 years, we add 391 plus 15 days. We come to August the 11th, 1840. Now, what happened on that date? Well, we'll talk about what happened on that date. We need a bit of room here again. And what happened was that the Sultan of that time, coming up to 1840, the Sultan of that time was not so strong anymore. He was quite weak. And in Egypt, there was a pasha or a leader or a king. It's a leader, more. And the Sultan was the king. And they had a war. And the pasha won the war basically and confiscated the Sultan's ships. So the pasha got the ships. And they were still arguing with each other because the Sultan wasn't fully conquered. So this fight was going to go on. And the allied powers of Europe, and those powers were, I need some more room really. Those powers were Russia, Prussia, England, and Austria. Those four powers, who were from so-called Christian powers, they interfered in this battle that was going to go on because they saw that the Sultan would be wiped out. And they told the Pasha, called Mohammed II, to back off. They told him to back off. And he said, no, I'm not going to. I'm going to keep these ships. And these said to him, give the ships back. So he did a tour of his tribes to see if he could build up enough strength to take on the Sultan again and to resist these powers. And he found that he was going to be beaten. He thought he was going to be beaten. So anyway, the Sultan was happy that these powers intervened because he knew he was going to be beaten. And so he surrendered his power to these powers. And he said to them, what happens if the Pasha doesn't give me my ships back and give me my land back? Because the Pasha took a lot of land too. And these powers, Russia, Prussia, England and Austria together said to the Sultan, don't worry about that, we'll take care of it. And so by that means, as originally John the Greek emperor had asked the Sultan if it was all right if he reigned in Constantinople, and the Sultan said yes. And so it was a peaceful change that took place. Saying back here, further on, the Sultan now gave back power to these nations. over himself because he was too weak, just like the Greek emperor had been too weak to resist it. And so this is a prophecy which took place to the exact day. I'd just like to read from a history book called The Great Controversy on page 334. In the year 1840, another remarkable fulfillment of prophecy excited widespread interest. 2 years before, Josiah Litch, one of the leading ministers preaching the Second Advent, published an exposition of Revelation 9, predicting the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So he predicted this before it happened. According to his calculations, this power was to be overthrown in AD 1840. This was his calculation before the event took place. Sometime in the month of August, he said. He didn't put on the 11th as being the exact date. And only a few days previous to its accomplishment, he wrote, allowing the first period, 150 years, to have been exactly fulfilled before the emperor ascended the throne by permission of the Turks, and that the 391 years, 15 days, commenced at the close of the first period. It will end on the 11th of August 1840. So right before, a few days before this date, a few days before he said it's almost certainly going to be the 11th. When the Ottoman power in Constantinople may be expected to be broken, and this I believe will be found to be the case, at the very time specified, Turkey, through her ambassadors, accepted the protection of the Allied powers of Europe, and thus placed herself under the control of Christian nations. The event exactly fulfilled the prediction. When it became known, multitudes were convinced of the correctness of the principles of prophetic interpretation. And so it gave a strong boost for the other prophecies that were being fulfilled around the same time. So we want to see that this was perfectly fulfilled. The 27th of July and the 15 days comes to the 11th of August. You can check it for yourself. And the 150 years comes to 1449. Then 391 years plus 15 days comes to this exact date. And God foresaw all this, of course, in his infinite wisdom, and he put it in the scriptures to convince us that the things that are yet in the future will also be fulfilled as the things in the past have. So let us take note of this. So we'll stop there and we'll continue with Revelation 10 next week. Now remember that every kingdom that builds its kingdom on force will fall one day, and that God's building a kingdom. He's already got it in heaven, but he wants to have a kingdom which will never finish. And this kingdom he is going to bring in very soon. And it won't be on this earth in the beginning, but later it will be on the earth. So we should want to be a part of that kingdom, a kingdom where truth and love, where there's no force, there's no deception, there's no violence, there's no wars, there's no sickness, there's no bloodshed, there's no misery, men putting misery upon other men. A kingdom of truth and love, where there's kindness, love, mercy, caring for every individual. So different to the terrible history that we can see enacted on this earth over time, the misery of which we know is only an infinite small part of the misery that's taken place on this earth. Of course, there's joy and happiness too, which is a picture of God and his love manifest in mankind. But these scenes of joy and happiness are interspersed in human history with blood, suffering and misery. So I'm sorry to say, human history is a pretty sad affair. So let's go with God and be in his kingdom where all is good, lovely, kind and loving. Thank you.